She owns 3,000 pairs of shoes and lived like royalty while her country struggled to survive. This is the story of Imelda Marcos. From small-town beginnings to becoming one of the most powerful and controversial first ladies in history. Her life tells a tale of glamour, power, scandal, and secrets so strong that still raise eyebrows today. So how did she rise so high, and what really happened behind the scenes to make her so controversial? Let's dive into the untold story of Imelda Marcos. Imelda Marcos's early life and rise. Before the diamonds, before the palaces, before the world would come to know her name as a symbol of excess, there was just a young girl with ambition burning quietly beneath the surface. Imelda Marcos was not born into the kind of wealth that would later define her image. In fact, her early life was marked by instability, emotional hardship, and a constant longing for something greater. Born on July 2, 1929, into a politically connected but financially strained family in the Philippines, Imelda's childhood was far from glamorous. She was raised largely by relatives after her mother died when she was just 8, and her father's law practice fell into disrepair. But even then, there were subtle signs, almost easy to miss, that Imelda was not destined for an ordinary life. She was strikingly beautiful, yes. But more importantly, she understood something many didn't. Beauty could open doors, but charm, intelligence, and timing could keep them open. And Imelda mastered all three. Growing up in Tacloban, she learned how to navigate people, how to present herself, and how to turn attention into opportunity. Those around her often described her as warm, magnetic, and deeply aware of how she was perceived. She wasn't just dreaming of a better life, she was studying how to build one. Her first major turning point came when she moved to Manila, the beating heart of Philippine politics and power. It was there that Imelda began to reinvent herself. No longer just a provincial girl, she stepped into a world of elites, socialites, and political figures. And she didn't just blend in, she stood out. In 1953, she was crowned Miss Manila, a title that would become more than just a beauty pageant victory. It was her official entry into high society. But unlike others who might have stopped at fame, Imelda saw it as a stepping stone. Because behind the smiles and elegance, she was calculating her next move. And then came the moment that would change everything. When Imelda met Ferdinand Marcos, it wasn't just a romantic encounter. It was the merging of two powerful ambitions. Ferdinand was already a rising political figure, known for his intelligence, discipline, and hunger for control. Imelda, on the other hand, brought charisma, beauty, and a natural ability to influence people. Their connection was immediate. Some would later call it fate. Others would call it strategy. What is undeniable is how fast everything moved. Within just 11 days of meeting, Ferdinand proposed, and Imelda said yes. It wasn't just a marriage, it was the formation of a political dynasty in the making. As the wife of a man climbing rapidly through the ranks of Philippine politics, Imelda quickly adapted to her new role. But she didn't remain in the background. Unlike traditional political spouses of the time, Imelda stepped forward, confident, visible, and impossible to ignore. She became a powerful asset to Ferdinand's ambitions. Where he was disciplined and calculating, she was charming and captivating. Together, they formed a perfect contrast, one that appealed to both the political elite and the general public. Imelda knew how to connect with people emotionally. She smiled, she listened, she made others feel seen. And in politics, that kind of influence is priceless. But beneath the surface, something else was forming. Imelda wasn't just supporting power, she was beginning to crave it. As Ferdinand's political career advanced, culminating in his eventual presidency in 1965, Imelda's role expanded far beyond ceremonial duties. She began involving herself in political decisions, diplomatic missions, and national projects. She wasn't content being a symbol. She wanted to be a force, and she was becoming one. Her early struggles, her rise through beauty and social circles, her calculated marriage, every step had been leading to this moment. The transformation was complete. The girl who once lived with uncertainty had now stepped into the center of power. But what the world didn't yet realize was that this was only the beginning. Because with power comes temptation. And for Imelda Marcos, the line between influence and excess would soon begin to blur in ways no one could have imagined. The First Lady who lived like a queen. Power didn't just change Imelda Marcos, it transformed her. By the time Ferdinand Marcos secured the presidency in 1965, Imelda had fully stepped into a role that went far beyond tradition. She wasn't content being simply the First Lady. In her mind, she was something more, an icon, a symbol, and eventually a ruler in her own right. And she wanted the world to see it. From the very beginning, Imelda began crafting an image that was impossible to ignore. She dazzled foreign leaders, charmed diplomats, and projected an aura of elegance that made the Philippines appear powerful, modern, and culturally rich. To many outsiders, she wasn't just a political spouse. She was a global celebrity. But behind the glamour was a lifestyle that would soon become the stuff of legend. Imelda believed that power should be seen, that wealth should be displayed, that influence should be felt in every room she entered. And so she built a world around herself that reflected exactly that. Lavish state dinners became routine. Extravagant events, dripping in luxury, were hosted with unmatched flair. She surrounded herself with the finest things, designer gowns, rare jewels, and an ever-growing collection of shoes that would later become one of the most infamous symbols of her excess. Thousands of pairs. It wasn't just fashion, it was a statement that she had risen far beyond the life she once knew. But Imelda didn't stop at personal luxury. She began reshaping the very image of the Philippines itself. She launched massive infrastructure and cultural projects such as grand theaters, art centers, and architectural masterpieces designed to elevate the nation's status on the global stage. The most iconic of these was the Cultural Center of the Philippines, which was meant to be a symbol of elegance, culture, and national pride. To Imelda, these projects weren't just buildings, they were monuments to her vision. Critics, however, saw something very different. They saw a country struggling with poverty while millions were being spent on appearances. But criticism rarely slowed Imelda down. If anything, it seemed to fuel her. She traveled the world extensively, meeting global figures, attending high-profile events, and forging relationships that expanded her influence far beyond the Philippines. She moved effortlessly through elite circles, rubbing shoulders with royalty, celebrities, and world leaders. And wherever she went, she left an impression. To some, she was captivating, inspiring, a woman who had risen from hardship to command global attention. To others, she was something far more troubling. Because while Imelda lived in luxury, cracks were beginning to show beneath the surface of the Marcos regime. Economic challenges were mounting, public dissatisfaction was growing, and yet the displays of wealth only seemed to intensify. It created a dangerous contrast. On one side, a First Lady draped in diamonds, hosting grand events, and building cultural landmarks. On the other, a population facing increasing hardship, watching from a distance. But Imelda didn't see any contradiction. She saw purpose. In her own words, she believed she was elevating the country's image, making the Philippines a destination of beauty, culture, and global importance. She saw herself not as excessive, but as visionary. And perhaps that's what made her so compelling and so controversial. Because she truly believed in the world she was creating. A world where power was glamorous, where the influence was dazzling, and where appearances mattered just as much as reality. But as history would soon reveal, that world was built on fragile ground, and the higher it rose, the harder it would eventually fall. Power, influence, and the shadow of corruption. By the early 1970s, the image of Imelda Marcos had evolved far beyond elegance and glamour. She was no longer just the face of power. She was becoming one of its architects. When Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in 1972, everything changed. What was once a democratic system shifted into something far more controlled, more restrictive, and more dangerous. Political opponents were silenced, media outlets were shut down, and power became increasingly centralized in the hands of the Marcos regime. And right there, at the center of it all, was Imelda. But she wasn't standing in the shadows. She stepped forward. Imelda began to take on official government roles that gave her direct control over key sectors of the country. She was appointed governor of Metro Manila, Minister of Human Settlements, and held multiple influential titles simultaneously. It was an unprecedented concentration of authority for a First Lady. She now had power over infrastructure, housing, urban planning, and access to enormous state resources. And she used it. Entire cities were reshaped under her direction. Massive housing projects were announced. Urban redevelopment plans were rolled out with ambition and speed. On the surface, it looked like progress, rapid, transformative, and visionary. But beneath that surface, questions began to grow. Where was the money coming from? Who was truly benefiting? Behind the grand projects and global appearances, whispers of corruption began to turn into accusations. It was alleged that billions of dollars were being funneled out of the country, which was hidden in secret accounts, invested in foreign properties, and used to fund a lifestyle that extended far beyond what any official salary could justify. And at the heart of those allegations was Imelda. She became synonymous with excess, not just in style, but in power. Reports began to surface of luxury properties in cities like New York, expensive art collections, and vast amounts of wealth hidden across the globe. To critics, it wasn't just corruption, it was exploitation. A nation's resources diverted to serve a ruling elite. Yet, despite the growing controversy, Imelda remained defiant. She continued to travel, to represent the Philippines on the world stage, and to project the same image of grace and authority that had defined her from the beginning. But now, the perception was shifting. To some, she was no longer just glamorous. She was untouchable, and that made her dangerous. Inside the Philippines, fear had begun to replace admiration. Speaking out against the regime carried serious risks. Many who opposed the government faced consequences that silenced dissent and maintained control. The Marcos era had entered a darker phase, and Imelda was no longer just part of the story. She was deeply embedded in it. Yet what made her role even more complex was her ability to maintain two identities at once. On one hand, she was a powerful political figure, deeply involved in governance and decision-making. On the other hand, she continued to present herself as a cultural ambassador, a patron of the arts, a promoter of beauty, a symbol of national pride. It was a carefully balanced image, but it couldn't last forever. Because as wealth accumulated at the top, frustration grew at the bottom. Economic struggles intensified. Public anger, once muted by fear, began to rise again slowly but steadily. And with every passing year, the distance between the rulers and the people became impossible to ignore. The world was watching. The truth was beginning to surface. And the empire that once seemed untouchable was starting to show signs of collapse. For Imelda Marcos, the power she had built, protected, and expanded was about to be tested in ways she never expected. Because no matter how strong a regime appears, no power lasts forever. Imelda's exile, comeback, and complicated legacy. In 1986, after more than 2 decades of authoritarian rule under her husband Ferdinand Marcos, Imelda Marcos's world came crashing down. Widespread protests and a massive popular uprising known as the People Power Revolution toppled the Marcos regime, forcing the family into exile in Hawaii, USA. They left behind a sprawling palace, allegations of massive corruption, and a now infamous archive of Imelda's possessions, including thousands of pairs of shoes that became a global symbol of the excesses of their rule. For nearly 5 years, Imelda lived in Hawaii with her children after her husband's death in 1989. Despite the disgrace of exile and mounting legal troubles, which includes dozens of charges related to graft, tax fraud, and corruption, she never abandoned her determination to return home. In 1991, President Corazon Aquino permitted her to come back to the Philippines to face the pending charges, a move aimed partly at persuading foreign courts to release billions of dollars of Marcos-era funds back to the state. Imelda's arrival was dramatic, greeted by supporters, surrounded by media, and still determined to claim her place in the nation's political life. Upon her return, Imelda Marcos attempted a political comeback that defied many expectations. She ran unsuccessfully for president in 1992 and 1998, but she did not retreat from the national stage. In 1995, she was elected as a congresswoman representing the province of Leyte, an office she retained through multiple terms despite continued legal battles and disqualification attempts. Imelda also sought leadership positions at various points, including a bid to become governor of Ilocos Norte in 2018, though she withdrew after being convicted on graft charges, a conviction she later appealed. Imelda's comeback was about more than individual ambition. It was part of a broader resurgence of the Marcos political dynasty. While she never returned to the presidential palace herself, her family did. In 2022, her son Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won the presidency, an achievement celebrated by many loyalists as vindication and by critics as a troubling sign of historical amnesia in the Philippines. Imelda, then in her 90s, was described as the matriarch and political force behind the family's return to power, illustrating how deeply her influence endured. Today, Imelda Marcos, well into her 90s, remains one of the Philippines' most debated figures. Her supporters view her as a survivor and national figure whose boldness projected the Philippines onto the world stage. Her critics see a woman who symbolized excess, corruption, and political immunity. Someone whose legacy continues to shape political life long after martial law ended. Many of the assets allegedly taken from public funds have been recovered by the government to the tune of about $3.6 billion by the late 2010s, but a significant portion remains unrecovered or disputed, reflecting ongoing uncertainty about the true scale and reach of the Marcos wealth. Imelda's legal battles. Imelda Marcos's life after power was not only about politics and comeback, it was also defined by decades of legal battles that exposed how the Philippine justice system grappled with holding one of the most powerful figures in its history accountable. Her legal struggles began almost as soon as the Marcos family was forced into exile in 1986 and continued for decades, becoming almost as storied as her political career. One of the most dramatic episodes took place far from home. In 1988, Imelda Marcos was indicted by a federal grand jury in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York on multiple charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Co-defendant in the case was Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, who was accused of helping conceal assets. During the long and highly publicized trial, prosecutors claimed that Imelda and her husband used more than $100 million in public funds to buy Manhattan real estate, art, and other luxury items. For many observers, the case seemed a turning point, a rare opportunity for an international court to bring justice. But the outcome was unexpected. After 3 months of testimony and extensive evidence presented by prosecutors, a jury acquitted Imelda Marcos of all charges in July 1990. During closing arguments, her defense successfully portrayed her as a poor widow unaware of her husband's actions, a narrative that resonated with jurors and resulted in her walking free. Back in the Philippines, the legal battles were even longer and far more complex. When the Marcos family was ousted, the government created the Presidential Commission on Good Government to pursue cases involving ill-gotten wealth. Imelda faced hundreds of graft and corruption cases spanning decades, most tied to the time she spent as governor of Metro Manila, Minister of Human Settlements, and a national legislator. One of the most significant of these was her prosecution by the Sandigan Bayan, the Philippines' anti-graft court. Charges filed as early as 1991 alleged that Imelda had used her various official roles to funnel millions of dollars of public funds into Swiss foundations that the Marcos family controlled. These foundations, prosecutors claimed, were a mechanism for moving ill-gotten wealth abroad and hiding it under the guise of private organizations. In 2018, nearly 3 decades after charges were first filed, the Sandigan Bayan's 5th Division handed down a dramatic verdict. Imelda Marcos was found guilty of 7 counts of graft and corruption for her participation in managing these Swiss foundations and diverting government funds while she was in official positions. The court sentenced her to between 6 and 11 years in prison for each count, adding up to a potential multi-decade sentence, and ruled that she was perpetually disqualified from holding public office. Yet the story did not end there. Imelda Marcos did not immediately go to prison. After the conviction, she posted bail and filed motions to appeal the decision. Her legal team cited her advanced age and health issues while seeking relief, and she was allowed to remain free pending further proceedings. Her lawyers filed motions for reconsideration and sought to elevate the case to the Supreme Court. setting in motion another chapter in her long fight through the justice system. Many legal experts and victims groups criticized the pace and outcome of the legal process, saying that the decades-long delay and procedural appeals illustrated deep flaws in holding powerful political figures accountable. Human rights advocates and organizations representing victims of martial law insisted that affirming her conviction would not only deliver justice for corruption but also for the broader abuses during the Marcos era, a period that saw thousands imprisoned, tortured, or killed. At the same time, other cases against her were dismissed for various legal reasons, including procedural delays and challenges to evidence, illustrating how complex and difficult it is to resolve historical allegations involving decades-old financial transactions and institutional power. Imelda Marcos's legal journey from international indictments to high-profile domestic prosecutions demonstrates how deeply her life was entangled not only with politics but with questions of justice, accountability, and the long shadow of power. Her courtroom experiences became another chapter in her remarkable life story, one marked by controversy, resilience, and a legal struggle that stretched across generations and borders. Imelda Marcos and how history remembers her. To truly understand Imelda Marcos, one must grapple not only with the facts of her life but with how those facts have been shaped, interpreted, and retold over decades. Her story exists at the intersection of myth and memory, where public imagination, political narrative, and cultural reinterpretation blur into something far more complex than simple biography. Imelda was more than a first lady. She was a crafted public persona long before modern social media shaped public figures. She embraced the trappings of global fame, fashion, art, state diplomacy, and media spectacle. Her extensive wardrobe, international tours, and performance-style public persona earned her monikers like the Iron Butterfly, a combination of elegance and political audacity that made her both admired and mocked abroad. On the world stage, she wasn't merely accompanying her husband. She was a figure in her own right, hosting foreign dignitaries, speaking at cultural events, and projecting the image of the Philippines as a nation of refinement and style. Yet, this international image, glossy, glamorous, captivating, often obscured the harsher realities back home. In the Philippines, the image of Imelda is far more contested. For many, her legacy is inseparable from the destruction of democratic processes, systemic corruption, and human rights abuses consequences of policies made under martial law, the regime she helped legitimize. At the same time, there are communities and local leaders who remember her contributions differently. Those who benefited from infrastructure projects, individuals who personally received support, and regions where the Marcos name still commands loyalty. These contrasting memories underscore how historical narratives can diverge not purely along political lines, but also along generational, geographic, and socioeconomic ones. Others argue that the fixation on Imelda's shoes, jewelry, and architecture overshadows deeper questions about structural power and accountability, that the spectacle distracts from the mechanisms that allowed corruption to thrive unchecked in the first place. As one journalist put it, the shoes are symbolic, but they are not the whole story. In recent years, documentaries, plays, and books have reimagined her life from serious historical works to cultural interpretations like the stage musical Here Lies Love, which weave narrative, performance, and political critique into a story that goes beyond headlines. Such works demonstrate that Imelda Marcos is more than historical footnote. She is a cultural reference point, a lens through which Filipinos and the world examine issues of power, memory, and justice. Whether presented as glamour personified or a cautionary figure in political history, Imelda's legacy refuses to be neatly wrapped up and archived. Her place in history is a debate still evolving, still charged, still unresolved. Imelda Marcos's life is a story of power, glamour, and controversy. From a young girl with big dreams to a first lady whose name became legendary, her legacy continues to divide and fascinate. Loved or reviled, admired or criticized, one thing is certain: Imelda Marcos's story. And the mark she left on the Philippines refuses to fade. And that brings us to the last question for today. What do you think about Imelda Marcos? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share with friends, and subscribe to her status for more.